Bonjour and welcome back to the World History course. This is your professor, Philippe Girard. In this section, we've studied various Native American civilizations, the Mayas, the Taínos, and the Aztecs, what they achieved and how they were impacted by the Spanish conquest after 1492. Today, we will conclude this section by looking at one last civilization, the Incas, to examine similar issues. The Incas were located in the Andes, a large mountain chain on the Pacific coast of South America, and that's the second highest mountain chain in the world after the Himalayas, and a fairly difficult environment to master. But multiple civilizations succeeded themselves in that region before the Incas came on the scene. People like the Paracas, who are famous for their weaving, the Moche, who are famous for their ceramics, and the most intriguing of them all, the Nazca people. And the Nazca lived in a desert area between the Andes and the Pacific coast, and they are known for their large drawings. Their technique was fairly simple. They simply pushed aside the dark rocks on the desert floor, revealing the lighter material underneath, and by doing so over long distances, they could make lines and then drawings of monkeys and lizards and birds and cats, some of them hundreds and hundreds of feet long. The purpose of these drawings, that's mysterious. Like the other people of South America, the Nazcans were illiterate. So it's not like they left behind a manual to explain the purpose of those drawings. Even more strangely, the drawings can't truly be appreciated from the ground level. To really grasp the magnitude of the whole drawing, you need to get into an airplane and fly over the desert, which, except the Nazca people did not have airplanes. So my guess is that those drawings were part of a mysterious religious ritual, but we'll never know for sure for lack of sources. Anyway, let's focus on today's civilization, and that would be the Incas, who came later in the history of Peru. The name Inca is a bit inaccurate. Technically, the Inca, that was only the title for the emperor, like Khan or king. And the people themselves should be called the Quechua people, which is also the name of their language. But the name Inca has stuck, and so I will use the term Inca for both the emperor and then the whole civilization, because that's what historians do. The Quechua people, they came from the central part of the Andes in what is today Peru, and their capital was located in Cusco. The Incas, they had a strange habit of building cities and monuments in the shapes of animals. So Cusco, that was supposed to look like a mountain lion, a puma. It's kind of hard to see that nowadays, even if you go to the top of a nearby hill, because, well, the city changed a lot after the conquest. But apparently, back in Inca times, some streets would mark the legs of the puma, or maybe the tail. And then if you went above the city, there was a fortress known as Sacsayhuaman. And if you have a hard time remembering all these Quechua names, think of it as the sexy woman fort. And that's the mnemonic device that I use. But anyway, the fortress of Sacsayhuaman, that was famous for its massive walls, which are laid out in a kind of a jagged pattern that was meant to imitate the teeth of the puma, the head of the puma in Cusco. I also want to point out that the largest of the stones in Sacsayhuaman, they weigh dozens of tons. And the Incas had no large draft animals like horses. And they didn't know about the crane, or the pulley, or even the wheel for that matter. And somehow they were able to drag those massive rocks up the mountain, carve them, and then position them so that they would fit perfectly. Just an amazing achievement of engineering. That name, Cusco, for the capital, that translates as navel of the world. And so just like the Chinese or the Middle Kingdom or medieval Christians with their Jerusalem, the Incas were convinced that they were the center of the world. And of course, everybody knows that Lake Charles, Louisiana, that's the true center of the universe. Anyway, from this city of Cusco, from the center of the world, the Incas were able to expand rapidly in the 15th century. And so under the reign of just 7 Inca emperors, they managed to conquer not just modern Peru, but a long stretch of land going all the way from the edge of Colombia to the north, through Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and then parts of Chile and Argentina to the south. And so that was an empire that was 3,000 miles long, and that was peopled by 10 million subjects, the largest Native American empire in the Americas. All that in just over a century, because like the Aztecs, the Inca Empire was a young empire, which was still in the process of expanding when the Spanish showed up on the scene in the 1500s. So how did the Incas do it? Well, organization, organization, organization. That Inca Empire was a very top-down structure. where orders were passed on to inferiors who were supposed to comply for the common good. For example, the Incas were known to ship entire Quechua communities to an area that they had just conquered to make sure that there would be loyal subjects there. And then they would take local villagers from another ethnic group and ship them to a distant area of the empire where they would have to struggle for years to adjust and to survive so that they would not have any time to rebel. And the man at the head of that pyramid was the Emperor Ai the Incas. And like many of the rulers that we've encountered in the class, he justified his rule by claiming to be of divine descent. And again, like many civilizations that we've studied, that god was the god of the sun, which the Incas, they called Inti. There must be something fascinating about this glowing orb up in the sky that people from Rome to Mexico to Japan to Peru, they all decided to worship the sun as a god. Remember how the Egyptian pharaohs will also claim to descend from a sun god, Amon-Ra, often intermarried to avoid diluting their precious divine blood? Well, the Incas also practiced incestuous marriage, which is never a good idea. Well, though in their case, the dynasty of the Incas were young enough by the time the Spanish came that the genetic defects, they had not gotten too severe yet in the Inca bloodline. Another similarity with the Egyptians, the Incas practiced mummification. The purpose was actually quite similar. By preserving the body, the Incas hoped to preserve the soul as well, and thus achieve immortality. The practice was not as widespread among the Incas as it was in Egypt, because in Peru, those who were mummified belonged mostly to the elite. Not everybody else was mummified. And on the Altiplano, which are the highlands southeast of Cusco, you can still find many chopas, which are the large cylindrical tombs of the elite of the Incas. And these are now empty because the Spanish conquistadors looted them after the conquest to find some gold. But originally, those chopas included the mummified remains of the elite, a bit like the pyramids of ancient Egypt did. The Inca emperors themselves, they were also mummified to ensure their own immortality. And in fact, these emperors would remain in their palace after their deaths with servants as if they were still alive because they had achieved immortality. And in times of peril, the new living Inca, he would even summon his ancestors, the mummified ones, so that he could have a little chat with them and seek their advice. Although I've always wondered how that would work in practice. When mountaineering became a big hobby in the 1940s and 50s, some hikers climbed the high peaks of the Andes, hoping to be the first to the top of this or that mountain. And in some cases, after hiking way up in one of the tallest mountains, those modern mountaineers, they encountered Inca monuments because the Incas had gotten there first, centuries earlier. And those mountaineers also found the bodies of young girls. Those girls had been brought to the summit of the mountain and left to die there as an offering to the god. The mountain air was so cold and so dry that the girls' bodies never had time to rot. Instead, the flesh was desiccated and frozen, and the body was preserved as a kind of a mummy. So this was a more low-tech technique of mummification than the one that the Egyptians had used back in ancient times, but it was very effective nonetheless in the climate of the Andes. Those human sacrifices indicate that for the Incas, mountain tops, they were considered divine because they were very close to the gods above. In fact, the Incas had a three-way vision of the world, which was represented by a favorite symbol of theirs, the Andean Cross. So notice the 3 steps in the cross. Every concept had 3 parts. So the earth was divided into 3 levels, the ground level where humans lived, and then the underground below, and the high air above, which were home to deities, both good and bad. 3 animals also ruled those 3 levels. The giant condor bird ruled the skies, the puma ruled the earth, which is the reason why the Incas modeled their capital after puma, and then serpents ruled the underground. In fact, near Cusco, there is a temple underground that is shaped just like an S, and it slithers its way through cracks in the rock. When I study the Incas, I'm always split between 2 emotions that are polar opposites. On the one hand, I think, boy, how backward they were. They didn't know steel. They did not know gunpowder. They did not have large draft animals. They did not even know riding, so technically they were prehistoric people. The closest that they had to a form of riding, that was the quipu, Quipu looked like a necklace attached to strings of yarn with little knots along the way. And the code of the Quipu is no longer not fully understood to this day, but apparently by using different types of knots and different colors, it was possible to express simple concepts like 15 adult llamas or 8 female guinea pigs, and so forth. So not a fully developed writing system, you could not write a novel with it, but more of a mnemonic device that was useful for tax collectors and the like. So those illiterate Incans were rather backward in many ways. And yet I can't help but be impressed by their many achievements, especially considering that they did all of that with minimal technology in one of the toughest environments on Earth. So here's an example: communication. We've seen that for large empires like the Persians or the Mongols, it was key to be able to get information to and from faraway corners of the empire. Well, communication, that was hard for the Incas. They did not have horses, they did not know the wheel, and they couldn't write messages down. And they had to travel across the Andes, the second highest mountain chain in the world. But they made do with what they had. They built an extensive road system, the Inca Trail, that spanned the entirety of their vast empire, all the way from the north to the south. And I've had a chance to hike a bit of it, and it's just impressive. Up precipitous slopes and down others, either by building a little zigzag up the mountain, or even staircases when the slope is too steep, or even a tunnel right through the mountaintop when no other option is available. And then to cross some valleys, the Incas built bridges, and not stone bridges with Roman arch, because, well, they didn't have the technology, but rope bridges made of grass. And so they would take some of that stringy mountain grass and then braid it into a small rope, and then braid those ropes into larger ropes, and so forth, until they had big ropes that they could extend from one side of the valley to the other, and then some courageous person could walk across. Very typical of the Inca ability to do a lot with little. And then once the trail was built, the Incas still had to carry the message. In the absence of horses, they used human messengers who had enough endurance to run up and down staircases and trails despite the elevation. And there would be relay stations every few miles where a runner could come in, maybe catch his breath, and then pass on a quipu or some oral message to the next runner. Remember, no writing, everything had to be memorized. And then from one runner to the next, the message could make its way over thousands of miles of trails across the Andes. That was called the Chasqui system, C-H-A-S-K-I. Very efficient enough that the Inca emperor, could even eat some fresh fish harvested in the Pacific Ocean and then carried over by runners all the way to the capital in Cusco. The most impressive of the Inca achievements, that would be their stone monuments, because they didn't know of concrete, they did not know steel, chisels, and yet they were some of the finest stone cutters in history. I already showed you the massive fort of Sacsayhuaman near Cusco. Well, the capital of Cusco itself, which is down in the valley, it is filled with monuments, like the Temple of the Sun, for example, which features exquisite stonework. And some of the stones in Cusco were cut in complex ways with 5, 10, or even 15 angles. And yet they fit so well that you could not stick a knife in the crack. All that done without the benefit of a piece of paper or pen, so that you could even draw the specs to begin with. The level of craftsmanship is just amazing. In a nearby Sacred Valley are more Inca towns such as Ollantaytambo, and they feature remarkable stonework as well. Notice on that stonework the little carving of an Andean Cross. That's a bit hard to see. And notice also how the large slabs of stones are connected not by mortar, but by smaller wedges of stone. And this way the building could adjust and move if needed. The Incas had learned to do that because they had gone through a major earthquake and had adapted their building techniques accordingly. Well, Peru went through 2 other major earthquakes after the conquest, around 1750 and 1950, and both times the Spanish-era monuments suffered major damage, while the Inca monuments escaped relatively unscathed. All that thanks to that earthquake-proof design. Maybe you had never heard of the various buildings that I showed you in Sacsayhuaman or Ollantaytambo, but I know for sure that you heard of Machu Picchu. That is the iconic city of the Incas. It is not in Cusco itself. In fact, it's located a fair distance away, about 100 miles or so, over some very rough terrain. So it's not easy to get to. Even today, there's no road that goes there. You can either hike the Inca Trail, which is a lot of fun, or you can take a train that goes up and down the mountains, also a lot of fun. So the town was so isolated that it was never found by the Spanish, either during the conquest or even during the 300 years of Spanish colonization after that. Machu Picchu was simply abandoned by the Incas and then decayed in isolation until the early 20th century when a Yale archaeologist stumbled upon it when looking for old Inca ruins in the region. And that archaeologist later wrote a great book about the discovery if you're interested in learning more about the process. Machu Picchu, that lies at a fairly low elevation, not too far from the Amazon rainforest, so it was overgrown with tropical vines when it was rediscovered in the early 20th century, but it has now been restored to its original splendor as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And that site is indeed quite unique. It lies in a peninsula framed on three sides by the steep canyon of the Urubamba River, so it can only be approached from one side. And if you draw lines from all the nearby peaks of the Andes, those that are visible in the distance, they line up right there in Machu Picchu, so the site has some cosmological significance as well. And that's quite evident that the town meant a lot to the Incas. The quality of the stonework there is as good as any place outside of Cusco. But why the Incas devoted so many resources to building a town in that kind of forbidding terrain? Well, that's the mystery. The site has some fields, but the place is really steep, so agriculture was extremely difficult and farming, that was clearly not the main draw. The Yale archaeologist who found the place in the early 20th century unearthed a lot of skeletons, with what he thought was a high proportion of women. So he thought that this might have been a palace for chosen women. And the chosen women among the Incas, they were young women selected all over the Inca Empire for their beauty and their intelligence. Then they would be raised in a special palace, and then they would be married off to nobles so that they would be part of the nobility, or they would remain as virgin priestesses of the gods. But it turned out the skeletons in Machu Picchu may have been misidentified as female, so that theory about Machu Picchu being a temple for chosen women, that might not be as rock solid as it looks like. When you do walk to Machu Picchu from the only accessible side of the peninsula, you have to pass through a gate in a wall. So maybe this was a kind of fortress built at the edge of the empire near where the Amazon rainforest began to guard the border, maybe. And there are also temples in town, including one dedicated to the condor, as well as sacrificial altars, so maybe this was a religious site instead. And then on the highest point of the town, there's also a place that has been identified as an observatory. So maybe that was a scientific site, or maybe all of the above. The Incas, they left no written document to explain the purpose of Machu Picchu because, well, they were illiterate. And there's no Spanish document because the Spanish never found the place. And there's no oral tradition since the Incas abandoned the site after a while. So we're left with archaeological clues that are far from clear. And to me, that just adds the mystery and the allure of the place. Let's now move on to the other main achievement of the Incas, not just building a vast empire or building impressive stone monuments, but also feeding a population of 10 million people in some of the most forbidding terrain on Earth. We're talking the Andes here, with mountains that are higher than 8,000 meters, or whatever that is in feet. Remember what I mentioned of the Columbian exchange, how in the New World the ecosystem was quite different from the species found in Africa and Eurasia? Well, that meant that the Incas had no large barnyard animals like cows and pigs and horses until the Spanish conquest. Instead, they relied on the llama and the alpaca, which are the domesticated versions of the wild guanaco and vicuña, respectively. So very useful to get some meat and some wool, and also to carry some small loads. But these llamas are closer to glorified goats than powerful steeds, so it's the kind of an unlikely animal to build an empire on. Despite its name, the guinea pig, that's not a pig, and actually it's not from Guinea, Africa, it's native to the Andes. And by the way, the French name for that is weird too. We call it a cochon d'Inde, a pig from India, which is also completely off. Guinea pigs, they were not pets for the Incas. Instead, they would scurry around the household until some special guest would arrive, and then it was time to grab one and cook it for the guest. And guinea pig is still a delicacy in Peru today that they call cuy. Though when it's roasted, it looks suspiciously like a dead rat. Speaking of weird local delicacies, a traditional drink in Peru is the chicha. That's an alcohol that's made from corn. In some recipes, a fermentation process is started by having a person chew on the corn kernels so that the enzymes from the saliva would start dissolving the sugars of the corn. So you're essentially drinking someone else's fermented spit. Anyway, back to the Incas. So aside from the llamas and the guinea pigs and fish from the Pacific Ocean, the bulk of the Inca diet consisted in local crops, especially corn and potatoes. The Incas and their predecessors, they had bred dozens of varieties of corn and potatoes, which were suited to the many variations in altitude, in rainfall, and temperature that can be found in the region due to the mountains. The Incas also had a technique whereby they would let the potatoes out in the dry, cold air until they were freeze-dried and ground those potatoes into a powder like modern instant mashed potatoes as a way to preserve food over the long run in case their crops failed one year. In case of crop failure, the empire could also step in, seizing food from some regions and then distributing it to others as famine relief. As I said, the empire was very top-down with some communistic features. Aside from the cold of the mountain, the main obstacle to agriculture was the steep terrain of the mountain. There was little level ground that was suitable for farming. And so the Incas simply built those fields using their masonry skill. They created artificial terraces by erecting lines of walls, like a topographic map in a way. And that was a huge amount of work, but that allowed them to farm slopes that would have been wasted otherwise. Obviously, when you invest so much effort into a tiny acreage, you want your land to be productive. So the Incas also dug channels to irrigate those terraces, and then they used natural fertilizers to keep up the crop yield year after year. One of those fertilizers was guano, which is bird dung, and there are a lot of birds along the Pacific coast of the Andes where the birds will feast on the fish and then do their thing, and so the guano deposits bird dung. That would be a good resource for Incan farmers. The other iconic Inca crop besides potatoes and corn, that would be coca, which is the coca leaf. The Quechua people to this day either infuse those coca leaves in hot water and drink it like a tea, or they make a little bowl of some coca leaves and then chew them like tobacco. And the active ingredient in coca leaves will act as a stimulant like coffee or the cola nut. And that allows the Quechuas to work harder, to combat fatigue, and endure the lack of oxygen at high elevations. In fact, the coca leaf was so important to the Incans in ancient times that the leaf played a role in their religious rituals as an offering to the gods. Either that, or it's possible to use modern chemistry to extract the active ingredient from the coca leaves, concentrate it, and then turn it into cocaine, which was an ingredient into the original formula of Coca-Cola, along with the cola nut from West Africa. Obviously, building the Inca Trail and Machu Picchu and the terraces and tending all these fields, all that required a huge amount of man-hours. To do all these projects, the Inca emperors did not pay workers. In fact, they didn't even have a concept of currency. They had gold, plenty of it, but the Incas only saw gold as a pretty building material which they could hammer into pieces of art. But the gold had no intrinsic value per se. So the Inca economy was built on bartering. I'll give you a bushel of potatoes if you give me, 2 bushels of corn. So when it came to hiring workers for public projects, the Inca emperors would use the mita system, which was a kind of labor tax. So basically, each citizen of the Inca Empire was expected to give away so many weeks of the year to the local temple, or to the noble, or to the Inca himself. And whatever work was performed during that time, like tending the fields for the state, for example, that was the equivalent of a tax payment, but in kind, not in cash. And that mita system was comparable to the various work duties that the serfs owed to their lord in European medieval times. Well, now that I've built up the Inca Empire, it is time to bring in a Spanish conquistador and tear it down. Our main character today will be Francisco Picero, who, like Hernán Cortés, was a petty Spanish noble who had not achieved much back in Spain. If I'm correct, he was a law student back in Spain, but he was fired from his university for violent behavior. So anyway, Picero went to the Caribbean and, well, he didn't achieve much there either. So by the 1530s, he was in his 50s, which was beyond the life expectancy in his time. So he was really hungry for gold and recognition, two of the three G's. And notice the date. The conquest of Peru took place in 1532 to 1533, i.e. about 1 decade after the conquest of Mexico by Hernán Cortés in 1519 to 1521. So if you notice many similarities between the two, that's not coincidental. Picero pretty much studied how Cortés had managed to defeat the Aztecs, and then he used the exact same playbook against the Incas. Starting with gathering intelligence. Before the actual conquest, Picero traveled twice to Ecuador in the northern part of the Inca Empire, and there he noticed that even the officials of remote provinces in the north had a lot of gold and plenty of manpower. So that was an empire worthy of conquest. He did not find an Inca equivalent to La Malinche, the female translator of Cortés, but Picero managed to capture a few Inca people, and he took them with him for a few years so that they could learn Spanish. And through those translators, he learned about Inca culture and whatever could be used against them, such as the fact that the empire was young and had expanded aggressively in recent years. Interesting, because that meant that Picero could recruit local Native American allies. Also, Picero learned about a god called Viracocha, who was a creator god who had left Peru and had a beard. So Picero used that story to try and depict himself as a god, Viracocha, returning from exile, the same way that Cortés tried to identify himself with Quetzalcoatl in Mexico. Another thing that Picero did during those initial forays into the Inca Empire was to introduce smallpox. That was not intentional, but that helped him a lot. Because after Picero left to gather up some men and supplies for the actual invasion, an epidemic of smallpox broke out in his absence, and that epidemic killed many Inca people, including the Inca emperor himself, Huayna Capac. And Huayna Capac died so suddenly that he did not have the time to appoint an official successor as Inca and send two of his sons, Huasca and Atahualpa. They claimed to be the official heirs, and they began a civil war against each other. So by the time Picero returned to South America for the actual conquest, he learned some good news. An epidemic was ravaging the empire, and the empire was split between two emperors who were fighting each other. That was very good news, especially since Picero only had 200 men with him, which is definitely not much when trying to conquer an empire of 10 million. That conquest was even more lopsided than the conquest of Mexico, where it was 500 Spaniards against only 5 million Aztecs. So through the Inca Trail, Atahualpa learned of Picero's arrival, but he chose to ignore the threat at first because he thought that his brother, Huasca, that was a far greater threat than some small band of foreigners. Only after he had dealt with his rival brother did Atahualpa finally make his way north to meet with the band of invaders from Spain. Picero and Atahualpa then met in the town of Cajamarca in Peru. This is one of those fascinating moments in world history when two groups from very different backgrounds come into contact. So let me set the stage for you. Picero got there first, so he settled in an enclosed area that was surrounded by a wall, kind of plaza, to wait for the arrival of Atahualpa. And Picero was confident of victory, but his men, they were terrified. After all, there were only 200 of them, they were deep inside enemy territory, and they were heavily outnumbered. Some apparently soiled their pants overnight. But Picero, he had a plan. The next day, Atahualpa showed up. He had a whole army with him, but he left most of his men outside in the field when he entered the enclosed plaza to meet Picero. That may seem stupid, but he felt safe. He was in his own land, and he was a bit complacent about the threat. So he met Picero and a priest called Friar Valverde. And remember that the Spanish conquest was supposed to be about gold more than God. Actually, it's the opposite. God more than gold. Sorry about that. So Picero made a point of letting the priest, God, talk first. And that priest, Valverde, he took a Bible and he began to explain to Atahualpa that he should convert to Christianity. So pause for a second and ask yourself, how would that have worked in practice? Sure, Picero had brought some translators, but some words like the Eucharist, or Holy Trinity, or Jesus, that would have been hard to translate when there was no equivalent in the Quechua language, or even the word Bible for that matter. The term technically means the book, But there were no books in the Inca world, since they didn't know of writing. So the priest told Atahualpa that the Bible was the Word of God. And Atahualpa took the book, held it to his ear, shook it, waiting for the Word of God. And nothing happened, so he just threw the Bible on the ground in disgust. And this is what Picero had been waiting for: blasphemy. He had tried his best to convert those heathens, God, but they had refused, so now he had the right to conquer them, gold. And all the men who had been hiding around the plaza, they came out in the open and they attacked. Atahualpa was mostly surrounded by hapless, unarmed servants, so he was helpless where he was. In fact, many of his men died in a stampede while trying to escape the plaza, and they kind of ran into a wall. Atahualpa himself was captured alive, and then the Spanish also defeated the army outside, in part through their superior armament, their horses, their steel armor, and their gunpowder. So the goal of Picero was to go straight to the top, the way Cortes had done with Montezuma. And because the Inca Empire was very top-down, now that Atahualpa was captured, the rest of the empire was leaderless, like some headless chicken. So no one dared to attack the Spanish for fear of harming their captive, the god emperor. And so Picero was able to walk all the way into the heart of the empire, unscathed, in Cusco, and simply set up shop in the palace of the emperor, whom he held as captive. And there he promised that he would release the Inca emperor unharmed if Picero received a ransom worthy of an emperor. 2 roomfuls filled of precious bullion, one filled with gold and one filled with silver, as I recall. And the Incas complied. After all, their emperor was a god, so he was worth everything. Anyway, they didn't value gold that much, so who cares? So they gathered up all the valuables from all the corners of the empire and brought them to Cusco, where Picero did not even have to lift a finger. The loot was delivered right to his doorstep. And then when he got all the gold and the silver that he wanted, he executed Atahualpa anyway. And that's how the mighty Inca Empire was destroyed by a tiny group of conquistadors. Just like with the Aztecs, the key to this surprising upset was smallpox, as well as cunning leadership, good intelligence, local allies, and then superior technology. I'm simplifying things a bit here, because in the aftermath of the conquest, some of the Incas kept on fighting, especially Tupac Amaru, a member of the royal family who kept on fighting the Spanish until his death in 1572. So he was officially the last Inca emperor. And I mention him because there was another indigenous rebel who launched a big rebellion against Spanish rule 2 centuries later, in the late 18th century, and who also took on the name Tupac Amaru II to honor the old Inca emperors of yore. But he was unsuccessful too. And then much more recently, in the 1980s, there was a guerrilla movement in Peru that called itself the Tupac Amaru movement. So if you yourself, after you graduate from university, you want to rebel against authorities in Peru, I guess the rule is that you have to call yourself Tupac Amaru, and then lose. The aftermath of the Spanish conquest of Peru, that bore a lot of similarities with what we encounter in the Caribbean and southern Mexico and the Mayan world. Once again, a Native American empire was turned into a Spanish colony, whose main purpose was to export riches and bullion to Spain. And there was a very large silver mine in Potosi, Bolivia, for example. And once again, Spanish rulers exploited the labor of the surviving indigenous people, using the old mita system of the Incas to facilitate the transition to European serfdom. Once again, the Columbian exchange introduced new diseases that ravaged the local Indian population, though that population eventually bounced back. So if you travel to Peru and Bolivia today, you'll encounter many descendants of the Quechuas and then other indigenous groups from the area, like the Aymara people or the Uru people of Lake Titicaca. Once again, ancient architecture was repurposed by the Spanish to symbolize the new colonial order. So the Spanish went around the capital of Cusco and they took over all the public monuments for themselves. The old palace of the Inca emperor, that became, well, the governor's mansion, of course. The palace of the chosen woman, well, that became a convent because a nun, that was a Spanish version of a virgin priestess of Viracocha. And throughout Cusco, you can read the history in the buildings, in the stone. The lower part of the wall that date from the Inca era, and then the upper part of the buildings that would come from the Spanish colonial era. Also, remember how in Mexico, Catholic missionaries incorporated old gods into new Christian practices like the Virgin of Guadalupe? Well, they did the same in Peru. The Andean Cross, which we studied earlier, well, that looked a lot like the cross on which Jesus died. So that was a useful symbol to recycle, especially since the cross consisted of 3 steps, like the Holy Trinity of the Catholics. What about Viracocha, that creator god with a beard? Well, maybe it was Jesus, and the Incans had been worshipping Jesus the whole time without knowing it. Just chant the name of the god that will facilitate the transition. Catholic temples, they were also built on top of the old ones. So the Sun Temple in Cusco, that became the basis for a new Catholic monastery. And I also remember seeing a painting of the Garden of Eden that had been done after the conquest in a Catholic church in Peru. And ostensibly, that was a Christian scene, the Garden of Eden, but the Quechua artist had incorporated a big snake there to tempt Adam and Eve, and then a big sun above. And I kept wondering whether these were Christian symbols or discrete allusions to the old snake and sun gods of the Inca. Well, that syncretic fusion of the old and the new, that is known as Andean Christianity. A hardcore Catholic would probably see this form of hybrid Christianity as heretical because it incorporates pre-Columbian practices, but in a world where a handful of Spanish missionaries tried to convert millions of pagan Inca worshippers in just a matter of years, recycling old practices and repurposing them for the new church, that was the most practical shortcut for conversion. And that is how some indigenous cultural practices survived all the way to the present time, despite the trauma of the Spanish conquest and then the Columbian exchange. So the Incas, they were the last civilization on our list. Overall, there were some general trends in this section on Latin America. All of the Native American group that we've studied, from the Mayas to the Tainos and the Aztecs and the Incas, they used their limited technology to sustain a large population. And usually, with the exception of the Tainos, erect impressive stone monuments. And all those civilizations came to an end. With the exception of the Mayas, who declined early and for reasons of their own, these civilizations perished due to the dual onslaught of Spanish steel, the conquistador, and Eurasian diseases, the Columbian exchange. And finally, all of these areas of the world underwent some kind of hybrid cultural development, developed hybrid religions, hybrid languages. All these, they are the hallmark of the complex Creole societies of Latin America to this day. It's our lasting legacy. Well, we're going to stop here for this section and also for this course. We have reached our target date, 1500. Heck, we even got to 1533 today at no additional charge to you. And if you're curious to know what happened after 1500 in the world, well, register for the second half of this survey course. Otherwise, just kick back, relax, and enjoy a well-deserved break. Au revoir, and goodbye.